In the first years of the 16th century, Florence had learned, over generations, how to make power look beautiful. Money moved through the city quietly, through ledgers and letters and favors, and returned as marble, fresco, ceremony. Rule did not arrive on horseback here. It arrived dressed as taste. The city believed, with good reason, that it had solved an ancient problem: how to be wealthy without seeming crude, ambitious without seeming cruel, dominant without seeming tyrannical. It called this balance liberty. But the new century opened on a different kind of Europe. Italy was no longer a stage on which Italians alone performed. Only a few years earlier, foreign armies had come down from the north and shown how easily the peninsula could be entered, crossed, and punished. Florence, which had always imagined itself clever, began to feel exposed. Old arrangements that once seemed permanent started to look like habits. Old pride started to feel like a wager. The city did not collapse. That is important. It adjusted, as cities do. People continued to marry, to argue, to invest, to pray. Artists still negotiated commissions. Merchants still calculated risk. The churches still filled. The councils still met. Yet something subtle was changing in the weight of words. Certain virtues remained admired, but they sounded less commanding when spoken aloud. Prudence began to matter more than purity. Survival began to outrank reputation. The question was no longer how Florence ought to live, but how it might endure. For men who had devoted their lives to public service, this was disorienting. Their education had trained them to speak of balance, restraint, civic honor, the common good. They had been taught that politics, at its best, was a moral art. Yet events did not respond to those categories. Events responded to force, timing, deception, and the quick exploitation of openings that appeared without warning. One could insist that this was a temporary disorder, that the moral universe would soon right itself. Or one could look more closely at what was actually happening and admit that the old vocabulary no longer explained the facts. Outside the city walls, power was becoming blunt. Inside them, it was becoming anxious. Offices changed hands more quickly. Loyalties shortened. Men spoke of friendship and faith, as if each word required a quiet condition. Everyone sensed that something had ended, but no one could yet say what had begun in its place. Florence continued to produce beauty, but its confidence had become watchful, as if the city were listening for footsteps in the dark. In the summer of 1498, the city was also trying to wash the taste of prophecy out of its mouth. Girolamo Savonarola had been hanged and burned in Piazza della Signoria, and the same streets that had carried crowds to his sermons now carried them back to business. Florence was not ashamed of having believed. It was too proud for that. It preferred to say, as cities often do after a fever, that it had merely been misled, and then to move on. But a residue remained, less a theology than a lesson, that words, spoken with conviction at the right moment, could seize a population as firmly as any militia. Government returned to its republican forms, still meeting within the stern rooms of Palazzo Vecchio. Men argued there with a solemnity that implied continuity. Councils, committees, procedures, votes. Yet everyone understood that these forms were now exposed to new weather. Italy had become porous. Armies and princes moved across it with an impatience that treated old jurisdictions as inconveniences. Florence could not afford another trance, but it could not afford cynicism either. It needed officials who could do work, quietly, competently, without drama. At the center of this practical need stood the memory and the shadow of the House of Medici. Florence had been shaped by their money and their patronage. It had also been bruised by the compromises that such stability demanded. Under Lorenzo de' Medici, the city had enjoyed something like peace at home and a certain finesse abroad. With Lorenzo gone, that finesse began to look less like mastery and more like good fortune. And fortune, as every Florentine merchant knew, is polite until the moment it isn't. It was in this mood, neither hysterical nor secure, that Machiavelli entered public life. He was not a noble, not a celebrated scholar, not a general. He was the sort of man a republic depends on, and then forgets to honor, quick with documents, exact with language, alert to shifts in temper. He was appointed to the Chancery, one of those bureaucratic titles that sound bloodless until you remember what a city-state really was. A small government surrounded by larger appetites, surviving as much by information as by force. The Chancery was the Republic's nervous system. It received reports, wrote instructions, drafted treaties, copied letters, turned rumor into policy, and tried, always late, always underpaid, to translate anxiety into decision. You can imagine him there, not in any heroic posture, but seated at a table where paper was always running out and the day's news always arrived late. The city's fate entered in fragments: a rumor from Milan, a warning from Rome, a merchant's anxious intelligence, a captain's request for money, a complaint from a subject town, a report from an envoy who was either too optimistic or too terrified. One learns a particular sobriety in such a place. In the pulpit, one can afford certainty. In an office, one must live with partial knowledge and still decide. This work trained the mind the way the sea trains a sailor, not by theory but by repeated contact with danger. It taught him that politics is not a contest of ideals in the abstract, but a contest of men under pressure, men with pride, resentment, hunger, fatigue, vanity, fear. It also taught him how much of government is performed with language, not the elevated language of sermons, but the tactical language of letters, phrases that must threaten without provoking, promise without committing, flatter without becoming ridiculous, conceal without lying too crudely. A republic cannot always strike. Often it must insinuate. It must buy time. And buying time, in diplomacy, is usually done with words. Florence had long lived by that art. It was a city of merchants, and merchants understand something princes sometimes forget: that reputation is a form of capital, and that the appearance of stability can be as valuable as stability itself. Yet after the French descent into Italy, appearances were harder to maintain. There had been Charles VIII of France, and after him other kings with other claims, all of them convinced that the peninsula was a chessboard awaiting their pieces. The Florentine problem was not to admire these powers, but to survive them. So Machiavelli was sent. In the new politics of Italy, an envoy was not a polite ornament. He was an early warning system. He traveled to courts where men spoke in courtesies and thought in weapons. He listened to speeches made for display and tried to infer the intention behind them. He learned, in other words, the intimate difference between what rulers said and what they meant. One of his early lessons came from Louis XII of France. France, with its larger resources and its confidence of destiny, could afford a kind of bluntness. When it promised something, it did so with the careless tone of a man making a note to himself. When it threatened something, it did so with the ease of someone used to being obeyed. A small state visiting such a court feels, even in its formal reception, the inequality that no etiquette can soften. The envoy learns quickly to notice the moment when friendliness is merely the mask of indifference. Another lesson came in the opposite form, the lesson of the agile, improvising prince, who has little inheritance and therefore must manufacture authority by speed. This is where Cesare Borgia enters the story, not as a melodramatic villain, but as a type. Borgia was one of those men the Renaissance produced with alarming ease, capable, charming, ruthless, sensitive to symbols, unembarrassed by necessity. He carried within him both the elegance of Italian culture and the brutality that the new politics seemed to require. Borgia also carried the advantage of family in high places. His father, Pope Alexander VI, sat in Rome at the center of a church that was at once spiritual authority and political engine. It is fashionable to speak of Renaissance popes as a scandal. It is more instructive to see them as a symptom. When Italy was fragmented and threatened, even the papacy learned to behave like a principality, hiring soldiers, making alliances, seizing territory, and presenting these actions as if they were still primarily theological. A sermon can sanctify many things. A bureaucracy can administer them. A dynasty can profit from them. Machiavelli's contact with Borgia gave him something more valuable than gossip, a case study in real time. Here was a prince building power rapidly, improvising methods as he went, negotiating with allies while preparing to discard them, using cruelty not as an outburst but as an instrument. Machiavelli watched the delicate art by which a rising ruler makes violence appear like justice, and audacity appear like inevitability. He saw that men will forgive harshness more readily than they forgive weakness, and that fear, when administered carefully, can be made to look like order. It was not that Machiavelli admired cruelty in itself. He was too intelligent for romantic wickedness. What struck him was efficiency, how quickly a man could alter a political landscape if he understood what most men prefer not to admit, that politics is not a sermon, and that the public, even when it speaks the language of virtue, often rewards results. There is a temptation, when telling this story, to make Borgia the model and Machiavelli the disciple. That flatters our appetite for tidy influence. The truth is subtler. Borgia confirmed something Machiavelli was already learning from the Chancery, that human beings, when frightened, bargain their ideals down to essentials. In such moments, the moral life does not disappear. It changes shape. Men begin to call necessary what they once would have called shameful, and they do so with surprising sincerity. If Borgia demonstrated the speed of the new politics, Florence demonstrated its vulnerability. The city, for all its wealth, was militarily fragile. Like many Italian states, it relied on hired soldiers. These condottieri were experts in the art of appearing dangerous while remaining careful of their own safety. Their business was war, but not the kind of war that produces decisive ends. Their livelihood depended on prolongation, negotiation, the threat of force used sparingly enough to preserve future contracts. They could win battles. They could also lose them conveniently. They were, in a sense, the perfect soldiers for a civilization that had refined everything except the willingness to die for its own freedom. Machiavelli grew increasingly impatient with this arrangement. A republic, he believed, should not outsource its survival to men whose loyalty was rented. A city that would not bear arms for itself, he felt, had already begun to accept servitude. This conviction, so often treated as a technical point in his later writing, was for him a moral one, self-defense as civic dignity. From this impatience came one of his most practical achievements, the attempt to create a citizen militia. It is easy to smile at such efforts from the distance of centuries and to point out their imperfections, but to attempt it at all was to challenge a long habit and a lucrative industry. It was also to assert, against the drift of Italian politics, that a republic is not merely a set of laws. It is a people trained to defend those laws. These years had their own texture. Paperwork and travel, embassies and councils, and behind them the long problem of Pisa. Pisa, which Florence considered a necessary possession, resisted like a stubborn memory of independence. The struggle over Pisa was not merely territorial, it was psychological. Florence wanted to prove that it could still command, still compel, still behave like a sovereign power. When Pisa was finally subdued, Florence enjoyed the relief of a task completed. But the larger danger remained. A city can win a local quarrel and still lose its century. Meanwhile, the papacy changed hands, and with it the tempo of Italian politics. Pope Julius II was a different kind of pontiff, energetic, aggressive, convinced that God's will could be advanced by artillery. Under him, the papal state behaved with renewed ambition, and alliances formed and dissolved with a speed that made yesterday's moral outrage into today's strategic necessity. Italy became a theater in which foreign powers fought, using Italian states as scenery and sometimes as weapons. In such a world, the Republic's servants must develop two habits: skepticism and endurance. They cannot be shocked by betrayal, they must anticipate it. They cannot depend on gratitude, they must proceed without it. Machiavelli learned to write with precision because precision was one of the few forms of control left to a small state. His dispatches were not philosophical, they were acts of survival. He was also sent north into a colder and more ponderous political atmosphere where power wore a heavier costume. In dealing with Maximilian I and the German world, Machiavelli encountered a different rhythm: slower deliberation, larger distances, more stubborn institutions. Italy, in comparison, seemed quick, inventive, unstable. The peninsula could produce genius at the level of individuals. It had trouble producing durable coordination at the level of states. Its brilliance was artisanal. Its weakness was collective. All this mattered because Florence's Republican experiment was living on borrowed time. In 1512, the city was pulled back under Medici control, aided by the pressure of foreign forces and the exhaustion of Florentine factions. A republic is always tempted to imagine that it is protected by its own virtue. It forgets how much it also depends on circumstance. When circumstance changed, the forms of liberty proved less resilient than the rhetoric had claimed. For Machiavelli, the change was immediate and personal. He was dismissed. Then came a darker passage: suspicion, arrest, interrogation. The new regime did not need to prove his guilt to find him inconvenient. It needed only to imagine that he might be useful to its enemies. He was tortured, one of those facts that later admirers sometimes pass over too quickly, as if pain were a footnote rather than an education. Torture does not merely hurt the body, it rearranges the mind. It teaches a man what power looks like when it is not pretending to be benevolent. He was released eventually, in part because the political atmosphere shifted again with the elevation of a Medici to the papacy, Pope Leo X. Such turns were common in the Italy of the time: a prisoner freed because of a celebration, a policy reversed because of a new alliance, a reputation rescued because a patron rose. A man could be condemned in February and forgiven in March. This was not mercy. It was the instability of power wearing the costume of providence. After his release, Machiavelli found himself not only unemployed but unplaced. In a republic, he had been a function. Under the Medici, he was a memory, and memories are dangerous because they suggest alternatives. He withdrew to the countryside, to a small property at Sant'Andrea in Percusina, near San Casciano in Val di Pesa. The move is often described as exile, but it was also something more ordinary and more humiliating: a demotion into private life. Here, the Renaissance appears in a less glamorous light. We tend to picture it as a parade of painters and patrons, a festival of brilliance. But most lives, even in an age of genius, consist of waiting. Waiting for a letter, waiting for an appointment, waiting for the mood of the city to shift. Machiavelli waited. He worked on his farm. He dealt with small disputes. He went into town. He played cards. He watched the seasons. And he felt, beneath the routine, the irritation of a man trained for public affairs, now reduced to private necessity. It is in this quiet that the story becomes most human. The scandal of Machiavelli is usually located in his ideas, but the source of those ideas is a familiar human wound: exclusion. Not romantic exclusion, no dramatic banishment to a distant island, but the quieter punishment of being ignored by the world you once served. This kind of exile sharpens perception. It forces a man to ask what his labor meant, what his loyalties earned, and what power actually respects. He had friends still in diplomatic life, and one of them, Francesco Vettori, became a thread connecting him to the city he could no longer serve. Machiavelli wrote letters. He described his days with a frankness that is almost embarrassing in its lack of pose, the petty irritations, the dull pleasures, the sense of time slipping. But he also described something else, an evening ritual that has the quality of a small private theater. After the rough clothes of the day, he would change, and in his study he would meet the ancients. He would read, argue, imagine himself back in conversation with minds that had governed empires and described human nature without sentimentality. This detail matters because it explains the tone of what he wrote next. The book that emerged was not drafted in the intoxication of power, but in its absence. It was a work produced by a man who had spent years looking directly at political reality, and who now had enough distance to shape those observations into an argument. Exile gave him time, injury gave him urgency. In 1513, he began drafting The Prince. It was not published then. It circulated privately, like a dangerous rumor in manuscript form. But in its conception it was both practical and desperate. It was, among other things, a job application, a demonstration of usefulness addressed to those who had dismissed him. One should not underestimate this. A great deal of political writing is disguised ambition. Machiavelli's ambition was not to preach to humanity, it was to return to service. He wrote as a man who believes he can still be valuable, if only he can persuade the powerful to read him. The dedication tells you his audience. He addressed the book to a Medici, seeking favor in the only currency he still possessed: insight. That may seem cynical. It may also be the only realistic choice for a man who wanted to re-enter politics. In a republic, merit can sometimes find a path. Under a dynasty, access matters more. The shape of the prince is famously spare. It does not begin with grand metaphysics. It begins with categories, types of states, types of rulers, types of acquisition. This is not pedantry, it is a method. By classifying political life, Machiavelli strips it of romance. He treats principalities the way a merchant might treat markets: different structures, different risks, different strategies for stability. He distinguishes inherited states, which can often survive with mediocre rulers because habit itself provides legitimacy, from new states, which must be held with deliberate skill. He distinguishes acquisitions won by one's own arms from those gained by the arms of others. He returns again and again to a single hard point: if you do not control the means of force, you do not control the state. Everything else, law, ceremony, piety, eloquence, is secondary. It may be noble, it may be useful, but it is not decisive. This is where the book offends. Most political writing before Machiavelli preferred to speak as if legitimacy and morality were the main engines of rule. He did not deny their importance. He denied their reliability. He wrote as if rulers must plan for the world as it is, not as it ought to be. In doing so, he did something that still makes readers uneasy. He separated the evaluation of political behavior from the effectiveness of political behavior. He also made a distinction that has been misunderstood ever since. The Prince is often read as a manual for wickedness, but its more disturbing feature is its refusal to treat wickedness as exotic. Machiavelli's cruelty is not satanic. It is administrative. He describes how harsh measures, if required, should be done quickly and then stopped, how lingering cruelty breeds hatred and therefore danger. He is not celebrating brutality. He is warning that brutality has consequences and that a ruler who does not understand those consequences will be destroyed. This is a cold kind of morality, a morality not of purity but of outcomes. It is also, in his eyes, a morality shaped by civic responsibility. A ruler who destabilizes a state through vanity or excessive softness can produce more suffering than one who commits a sharp crime to prevent prolonged chaos. Such reasoning is repellent to the tender-minded and irresistible to those who have watched civil disorder. It is the logic of emergency, dangerous because emergencies are easy to claim. One of his most famous formulations is that it is safer for a ruler to be feared than loved if he cannot be both. The sentence is quoted so often that it has become a slogan, and slogans are the death of thought. Machiavelli's point is narrower. Love, he argues, is fragile because it depends on the feelings of others, and feelings change with convenience. Fear, if managed without provoking hatred, can be more stable. Even here, he insists on a limit. Avoid being hated. Fear can be a tool. Hatred is a poison. There is, throughout, an obsession with appearances. This, too, is not mere cynicism. Politics, Machiavelli suggests, is a theater in which most of the audience judges by what it sees, not by what is true. Therefore, the ruler must learn to appear virtuous even when necessity forces him to act otherwise. He does not say that virtue is worthless. He says that virtue, if it refuses to contend with perception, is impotent. This is one of the book's most uncomfortable insights, that morality, in public life, often becomes performance. The ruler must cultivate trust while planning betrayal, must speak of faith while preparing for contingency, must radiate mercy while keeping instruments of severity ready. The contradiction is not a personal defect. It is a structural feature of political life when survival is uncertain. Machiavelli's metaphor of the ruler as both lion and fox captures this. Strength to frighten enemies, cunning to avoid traps. He had seen traps. He had watched alliances shift, promises dissolve, and pious declarations become weapons. He had seen Florence bargain, plead, bluff, and retreat. He knew that a state that relies on honesty alone is like a merchant who insists that all customers will pay their debts because paying debts is good. The book also introduces, with remarkable economy, a pair of concepts that do not translate neatly, but have become central to later thought: virtue and fortune, or rather, virtu and fortuna. Fortuna is the unpredictable element, chance, circumstance, the flood that sweeps away careful plans. Virtu is not moral virtue in the Christian sense. It is capacity, skill, boldness, adaptability, the strength to shape events rather than merely endure them. A successful ruler is not one who is good, but one who has enough virtu to manage fortuna, or at least to recover quickly when fortune turns. To illustrate this, Machiavelli reaches for examples that blend history and legend. He speaks of founders who created new orders through force and imagination: Moses, Cyrus the Great, Romulus, Theseus. The choices are revealing. These are not gentle reformers, they are creators. They seize moments of disorder and impose a new structure. Whether one admires them or fears them, Machiavelli treats them as the type of actor Italy lacked, the founder capable of unifying fractured forces into a durable state. In this sense, the prince is less nihilistic than it appears. It is animated by a longing, almost patriotic, for Italy to stop being the playground of outsiders. Its hardest passages emerge from a diagnosis that Italy's weakness is not merely military, but psychological, a preference for elegance over solidity, for private genius over collective discipline. The mercenary system, in his eyes, was not only inefficient, it was a confession of civic decay. This is why he spends so much attention on arms, on the necessity of a ruler commanding his own forces. He had seen what happens when a state's defense is subcontracted. He had watched commanders maneuver for profit while cities paid for the privilege of being betrayed. His insistence on citizen arms was not an antiquarian love of Rome. It was a practical demand that a community take responsibility for its own continued existence. If the book ended there, it would still be sharp, but it might not have terrified kings. What truly unsettled later rulers was the book's candor about how they already behaved. Princes do not fear new wickedness. They fear exposure. They fear being described in language stripped of sanctifying fiction. Machiavelli, by writing as he did, made it harder for power to pretend it was merely virtue with resources. This is also why the book made moralists furious. It seemed to instruct rulers to deceive, to break faith, to perform goodness. But Machiavelli might have replied that he was describing, not inventing, that rulers already did these things, and that pretending otherwise merely left citizens defenseless against the reality of politics. One can object, with justice, that description becomes permission. But one must also admit that ignorance is not purity. The book forces that unpleasant choice between an innocent politics that cannot survive and a realistic politics that may corrode the soul. The Prince contains another subtle provocation. It is written without theology. God appears mainly as a rhetorical ornament. Fortune replaces providence. Human choice replaces divine plan. The Christian framework is not attacked. It is quietly bypassed. This alone would have made it suspect, because it implied that political success could be achieved without spiritual legitimacy, or at least without making spiritual legitimacy the primary cause. Yet Machiavelli was not a modern atheist writing against religion. He was a Florentine writing within a culture where Christianity was woven into public life so deeply that it did not need to be argued. His move was different. He treated the political realm as having its own laws of fear, ambition, imitation, faction. He wrote as if these laws operate whether one prays or not. That is what made him seem impious, not denial, but indifference. If one wants to locate the Durant drama here, it is in the collision between two moral languages. The older language, still dominant in public speech, says that rulers should be just, merciful, faithful, devout. The newer language, forced into existence by the chaos of Italy, says that rulers must be effective, vigilant, adaptive, sometimes cruel. Machiavelli does not reconcile these languages. He exposes their conflict. He also exposes the fragility of republics. This is the irony of his reputation. The Prince is about princes, yet Machiavelli's deeper loyalty, shown elsewhere, leans toward republican life. In discourses on Livy, he is more expansive about civic virtue, institutional balance, the energy that comes from a people sharing responsibility. The Prince book is shorter because it is written for an emergency, how a single ruler might seize a fragmented situation and create stability quickly. This distinction matters if you want to treat Machiavelli as a whole man rather than as a label. The Machiavellian caricature is a creature of later polemic, a devil who taught kings to be wicked. The real Machiavelli was a disappointed Republican realist, trying to find a path for Italian strength in a time when republics were failing and foreign powers were carving the peninsula into interests. He could admire Rome's republican vigor and still conclude that Italy, in 1513, might need something closer to princely unity to survive. That is not a contradiction. It is a tragedy. Near the end of The Prince, the tone shifts. After all the cold counsel, Machiavelli turns toward something almost like exhortation, a call for the Medici to liberate Italy from foreign domination. Here the book reveals its emotional core. The earlier chapters can be read as technical advice. This final impulse is more like a plea. Stop being merely clever. Become strong. Do for Italy what no one has done in living memory. Unify it, defend it, give it a shape that can resist outsiders. This closing is also perhaps the most political part of the book in the narrow sense. It flatters its audience. It suggests to a Medici that destiny has placed him at the center of a historic opportunity. It offers glory in exchange for action. The tone is deliberately elevated, as if Machiavelli, after stripping away illusions, must restore at least one heroic purpose so that action is possible at all. Men do not move history by logic alone. They move it by desire. And here we reach one of the strangest features of the book's life. It did not accomplish Machiavelli's immediate goal. It did not return him to the center of government. He remained on the margins, occasionally useful, never fully trusted. He wrote other works, The Art of War, which returns to the problem of citizen arms with more system and less urgency, and Florentine Histories, which looks back on the city's long turbulence with the melancholy of someone who has seen patterns and knows how rarely they change. He watched new disasters gather. He lived long enough to see Italy's vulnerability confirmed again in blood. The Prince itself traveled a different path. It circulated, offended, fascinated, provoked imitations and denunciations. Later generations read it as a license for tyranny or as a warning against it. Some rulers used it as a mirror and disliked what they saw. Others used it as a manual and pretended they had never opened it. Its sentences escaped their context and became daggers in other people's arguments. The Catholic Church came to treat the book with suspicion, not only because it seemed immoral, but because it presented politics as a domain that could be understood without priestly mediation. This was always the deeper threat, the suggestion that men could analyze and manage power using human reason alone, drawing lessons from history rather than commandments from heaven. Meanwhile, the word Machiavellian was born, a curious fate for a writer who, in life, wanted above all to be employed. To have one's name become an adjective is to be reduced to a single caricature. Machiavelli has suffered that reduction more than most. The caricature makes him an apostle of evil. The book itself is more complicated. It is the work of a man trying to keep states alive in a world where states were dying. One can, of course, object to him. One can argue that by normalizing deception and cruelty, he contributes to them. One can argue that once rulers are told that morality is merely a costume, they will wear that costume less often. One can argue that the attempt to separate political success from ethical goodness is itself a moral disaster, because it encourages men to treat human beings as instruments rather than as ends. But one should also admit the pressure under which he wrote. Italy in 1513 was not a philosophical seminar. It was a contested territory, and Florence was a small city within it. The men who spoke most loudly about virtue were not always the men whose actions preserved liberty. The men who preached purity were sometimes the men who invited catastrophe. Machiavelli's unforgivable act, to some, was to stop pretending. If one reads him with attention rather than outrage, another possibility emerges that he was not teaching princes how to be wicked, but teaching citizens how princes actually behave. In that reading, the prince becomes a kind of immunization, bitter medicine administered so that political innocence does not become political suicide. The book then terrifies kings for a different reason. It educates their subjects. Yet even this charitable interpretation has limits. Knowledge does not automatically produce virtue. A people can learn how rulers manipulate them and still prefer manipulation because manipulation is comforting when it comes wrapped in certainty. Florence had already learned this under Savonarola. It could learn it again under secular banners. Machiavelli himself knew that truth alone does not save. That is why, after analysis, he ends with exhortation. He offers not only insight, but a hope of collective redemption through national strength. Perhaps the deepest Durant-like irony is that Machiavelli, the realist, had to end as a romantic. After pages of cold-eyed instruction, he appeals to glory, destiny, and the liberation of the homeland. He knew the mechanics of power. He also knew the human need for meaning. A state held together only by fear is brittle. A state held together by a shared story has a chance to endure. Machiavelli despised illusions, but he understood that some illusions are the glue of civic life. So the manual written in exile is not merely a cynical handbook. It is the product of a particular historical predicament, a brilliant but divided civilization confronted by stronger, more unified powers. It is written by a man who served a republic, was discarded by a dynasty, tortured by suspicion, and then left alone with his thoughts. Out of that mixture, experience, humiliation, patriotism, and an unsentimental view of human nature, came a small book with a long shadow. If it frightened kings, it was because it implied a terrifying thing, that the aura surrounding authority is optional, that the sacred language of rule is, to a degree, a technique, that politics can be studied like any other human craft, with its own tools and its own tricks. And if those tools and tricks can be named, they can be anticipated. Florence, with its beauty and its anxieties, was the perfect place for such a book to be born. The city had always understood appearances. It had always turned wealth into art, ambition into elegance, power into ceremony. Machiavelli simply asked what lay beneath the ceremony, and he wrote his answer with a clarity that has outlived the circumstances that produced it. He did not invent the darker impulses of government. He merely refused to avert his eyes from them. That refusal, more than any single maxim about fear or deceit, is what continues to unsettle readers. It forces a question that each age, in its own way, must face. How much morality can survive contact with necessity, and how much necessity can be managed without destroying morality altogether? A book that asks that question honestly will always be dangerous, it will always be useful, and it will always, in the end, be written not in palaces, but in the uneasy spaces where a man has time to think, and where the world has given him every reason to be truthful.